Welcome to Chapter 42, Gas Exchange and Circulation. By the end of this chapter, you should be able to explain the relationship between the respiratory and circulatory systems, describe the factors that affect oxygen and carbon dioxide levels on land and in the water, explain how gas exchange organs function to maximize the rate of diffusion of gases, explain how gases are transported in the blood, and explain how the circulatory system functions to supply tissues with oxygen and the nutrients and remove wastes. Okay, so oxygen and carbon dioxide, we have to continuously exchange them with the environment, so we have to always get oxygen, we have to always get rid of carbon dioxide because our cells need ATP, right? Produced by our mitochondria. And so all of these gases, along with the various wastes and nutrients and all the other kinds of molecules that we need, have to be transported around the body. So there are 5 major steps to gas exchange. So the first step is called ventilation. And this is just the mechanical movement of air or water through any kind of a specialized gas exchange organ like a lung or the gill. Okay, so this is out here. So this is the interaction between the environment and the organ. All right. At the surface of the respiratory surface, so it could be a lung or a gill, actually even in some species it could be the skin, right? Diffusion occurs. So oxygen is moving from the air or the water into the blood, so there's more oxygen outside than inside, so the oxygen is coming in. There is more carbon dioxide inside than outside, so the carbon dioxide is going out. Okay? Okay, so circulation is the transport of the dissolved oxygen in and carbon dioxide out throughout the entire body by the circulatory system. All right, diffusion at the level of the tissues is when the oxygen is moving from the blood into the tissues to get to the place where it needs to go. Okay, so the oxygen is diffusing to the tissues and to the level of the cells so that the cells can take on the oxygen. Similarly, carbon dioxide that's being expelled is being taken up by from the tissues into the circulatory system so it can be transported out of the body. And then finally, cellular respiration is happening within the cells. So this is where the cells are using oxygen to make ATP and producing carbon dioxide as a byproduct. So if you look inside the cells are going to have relatively low levels of oxygen, right? So the oxygen is going to want to come from the blood where there's more oxygen into the cells where there's less oxygen. And because cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide as a byproduct, there's lots of carbon dioxide here and not so much in the blood, so the carbon dioxide will diffuse from the cell and into the blood. All right, so without looking at your notes, can you describe each of these steps?
Oh, I'm gonna do ventilation.
All right, what's ventilation?
That's just like interaction between like the outside environment and the actual place where the gas is going to be exchanged, like the gill or the lung or the skin.
Okay, good. So what's diffusion? What's this first diffusion?
Yeah, that's when at the actual surface of the gills or the lungs or whatever, that's where the oxygen's coming in and the carbon dioxide going out.
Okay. What's circulation?
That's just where the stuff is getting moved around in the body, just smushing around.
Okay. And then what's the other diffusion? That's when the oxygen is diffusing from the circulatory system into the cells, and when the carbon dioxide is moving from the cells into the circulatory system. All right, what's cellular respiration?
It's using mitochondria to make ATP.
Yep. Okay, so the respiratory system, or the respiratory system, depending on whether you're British or not, I guess, is responsible for ventilation and diffusion. So the respiratory or respiratory system is the various cells, tissues, and organs that are responsible for gas exchange. And some animals, like, I don't know, like a nematode or an earthworm, they use the skin for this. But in most species, there's a specialized organ like a lung or a gill or trachea in an insect that are responsible for gas exchange. Okay, the circulatory system is the system of tubes or whatever that moves the oxygen and carbon dioxide and other materials around the body. So then the gas exchange, getting material into the circulatory system and then getting it back out of the circulatory system happens based on diffusion. All right, so gills are basically outgrowths used for gas exchange in aquatic animals. So, for example, these external gills here are very, very thin epithelial tissues that have a huge surface area to allow oxygen to diffuse in and carbon dioxide to leave. In invertebrates, the gills can be external, like this. So this is a tube worm, so they have an external gill, or it could be internal. So this is the inside of a lobster. If you take the carapace off, you can see they have gills like this. And you probably saw gills when we did our lab on crabs, right? On bony fish, the gills are on the sides of the head and have these four arches. I guess the gills are internal because they're protected by this kind of a flap called an operculum. And the water will move in one direction over these long, thin gill filaments that extend from each gill arch. So this is a picture of the fish, but I know they don't look like this normally because they have this flap called an operculum covering the gills. Okay, and so this is each of the four gill filaments, and then a detail of the gill filament. They have lots and lots of these capillaries, and they have these gill lamella to kind of give structure so that the gills don't just all collapse. Yeah, so each gill filament is composed of hundreds and thousands of these sheet-like gill lamella, and there's a tiny little bed of blood vessels called capillaries that runs through each lamella to be able to put oxygen, to collect oxygen from the gills when the fish is breathing in, and then pass the oxygen out. Pass the carbon dioxide out. Insects have trachea, so these are these tubes that are filled with air, and there's a little opening, which you can see on some kinds of insects, like this caterpillar. And the opening to the outside world is called a spiracle, and these can be closed to minimize water loss. So air is just moving from the atmosphere through the spiracles into the trachea, and then to the tissues in the cells. In small insects, they don't have to do anything else to be able to get enough oxygen. In very large insects, the insect can actually pump their wing muscles to be able to open and close a trachea that kind of pulls extra air in. So sometimes like really big moths will be able to pump their wing muscles or their abdomen to be able to pull in extra oxygen. We think that trachea, the system of being able to get oxygen through trachea, is actually what might limit the ultimate size of an insect. So we know that in the Paleozoic, this is when the atmospheric oxygen increased, right? And so this is the time in the fossil record where you see these giant insects, huge dragonflies and stuff like that. But as the oxygen dropped in the Mesozoic, all of these insects went extinct. So we think that's our justification for saying that we think that in order to get massive insects like we had in the past, we would have to have more oxygen in our atmosphere. All right, let's look at vertebrate lungs. So we have a trachea, this tube here, that carries inhaled air to narrower tubes called bronchi. So we have two bronchi going this way. And then the bronchi branch and branch and branch into narrow and narrower tubes called bronchioles. So each of these is a bronchiole. And so the organ that, for ventilation is called the lung. So the lung is the part that encloses the bronchioles and part of the bronchi. And so mammals, birds, reptiles, and amphibians, and some fish have lungs. In amphibians, they don't have this kind of complex structure to the lungs. Instead, they just have a sac lined with blood vessels. But most amphibians can also get a certain amount of oxygen through their skin too, because they have such, kind of permeable skin. In mammalian lungs, the end of the bronchioles have these little tiny sacs on them called alveoli, and so these are able to increase the surface area for gas exchange. A human has approximately 150 million alveoli per lung, so we have lots and lots of these, and each of these is covered by tiny little capillaries to be able to take up oxygen from the lungs. All right, so ventilation, right, this is bringing the air in, has two steps in the human lung. inhalation and exhalation. So during inhalation, we have a kind of a membrane here that is under muscular control called the diaphragm, right? And that goes right here in the body. And when we inhale, the diaphragm is pulled downward. So when you inhale, you can try it all. All right, can you feel it? Your diaphragm is pulled down. When your diaphragm is pulled down, the area in your chest, there's more area in your chest, basically, right? So if your mouth is open, you will suck air in like this, okay? And so that'll kind of fill that vacuum. When you exhale, the diaphragm relaxes and the air just is expelled from your lungs. So it takes muscular effort to breathe in, but breathing out, it just, you just relax the diaphragm and the air is exhaled, okay? So normally, again, exhalation is a passive process. However, if you are running or doing hard exercise, you might also, use energy to exhale too. So if you're like puffing out quickly in order to breathe in again, you could use muscles to do this too. So this process is very similar to kind of a system, like kind of showing as a model of negative pressure. If you were to have a jar that had an open bottom on it, and you put a kind of a balloon over the bottom, right? If you were to pull down on the balloon, that would cause more space in here, and that would cause this internal balloon to inflate, right? If you were to let go of this membrane at the bottom, that would force all the air out of the balloon and back out, okay? We haven't really talked about the lymphatic system, but I'm just going to bring it up briefly so you know what it is. So our circulatory system is under extremely high pressure, and it's a closed system, right? So just all of the blood being squished through our circulatory system is always going to produce leakage. So there's a small, steady leakage of fluid from the blood vessels into the space around the blood vessels, and that is collected by the lymphatic system. Okay, so the lymphatic system is just there to drain the excess fluid coming out of the circulatory system. It is a bunch of these thin-walled branching tubules called lymphatic ducts or vessels, and so the interstitial fluid will enter the lymphatic ducts, and that is called lymph, and then the vessels join together to form larger vessels, and then the largest vessels will return the excess fluid to the veins entering the heart. So you might be familiar with your lymphatic system if you have some blockage somewhere, right? Because you'll end up with fluid and swelling in the tissues, or if you're sick, maybe somebody will reach over and feel your lymphatic nodes on the side of your neck, right? So that would be maybe your main way in which you might be aware of your lymphatic system. All right, so in animals with a closed circulatory system, the heart will have an atrium or multiple atria. So the atrium receives the blood returning from circulation. The name atrium comes from the way that Greek homes were organized, so that you had a kind of a doorway where you walked in. So the atrium is always where blood is entering the heart, okay? The ventricle is the kind of big muscly part that propels the blood out of the heart through the circulatory system. So we can see some variation in the structure of the heart amongst animals. So for example, if you look at a fish, it has one atrium, so the blood is entering into the atrium and then being pumped out through the ventricles, right? And so it's, I guess, going in both directions, or maybe it's coming in from getting it wrong. It's going from the ventricle, I guess, to the gills, where it's getting oxygenated, and then back around to the atrium. An amphibian has a 3-chambered heart, so they have 2 atria and then a ventricle where blood can mix in the middle. So oxygenated blood is coming from the lungs into this atrium and then into the ventricle, and then blood is being pumped, and then that's being pumped out to the body, right over here. And then the deoxygenated blood is coming from the body into this atrium, into this ventricle, and then being pumped into the lungs. Something like turtles, lizards, or snakes have a kind of a similar structure. It looks a little bit different, but the same basic premise here, where you have mixing. So they have 1 ventricle and 2 atria. So oxygenated blood is coming from the lungs into the atrium, into the ventricle, where it's being pumped to the body. You can see in the middle it gets kind of mixed up with some of the deoxygenated blood. That's that purple part. You kind of have this other weird path here. And then blood Deoxygenated blood is going from the lungs. Where are we going here? Oh no, it's coming from the body into the atrium, where it's going into the ventricle and then being pumped into the lungs. And then we also have this other pathway here with the mixed blood, which is going back to the body. We have something similar happening with the crocodilians, except we have two separate ventricles. So the blood is going from the lungs into this atrium to the ventricle and then out to the body. Deoxygenated blood is coming from the body to this atrium to this ventricle, where it either goes to the lungs or kind of semi-oxygenated goes back to the body. And then in birds and mammals, we have a very similar four-chambered heart. So blood is coming from the lungs into the atrium over here, pumped into the ventricle and then to the body. And then deoxygenated blood is going through an atrium, through a ventricle, and then back out to the lungs. Okay. One thing I will point out now, in case I forget to point it out later, is we have names for the atria when you have four of them. We have a left and a right, but they're not the left and the right the way that you would think. It's as if we're looking at the person lying there on the table, or I guess in this case the bird. And so this would be the right side, the right atrium, and the right ventricle, and this would be the left atrium and the left ventricle, because that's the point of view of the animal lying on the table. Okay. Okay. So here's a more detailed picture of the human heart and the pathway that it's going. So we have two kinds of two pathways that I just showed you. So the one of them is called the pulmonary circulation, and this is what carries the deoxygenated blood away from the right ventricle of the heart to the lungs, and then returns the oxygenated blood to the left atrium and the ventricle of the heart. So let's go through this. All right, the blood is entering the right atrium, and you're like, wait, it's on the left side. But it's on the right side of the person whose heart it is, right? Okay. So blood is entering the right atrium as it returns from the body. So this arrow is like, you know, your head and your stuff that's above your heart. And this is the stuff that's coming from below your heart, like the bottom of your body. So this is called the superior vena cava. This doesn't say anything. This would be called the inferior vena cava, right? All right, so now the blood is in your right atrium. Okay, the blood is pumped from your atrium into your ventricle. Blood always goes from the atrium into the ventricle, okay? It goes through a valve called the right atrioventricle valve, right here, the AV valve. And now it's in the right ventricle, okay? Then blood is pumped, so the right ventricle you can see is really big compared to the atrium. So this is the tough pumper that pumps really hard. So it's being pumped from the right ventricle into the lungs, and so it has to leave the heart. It goes out of the pulmonary valve to the pulmonary artery, and there it goes to the lungs to get oxygenated. Okay, now we go on to step 4, and we enter the systemic circulation system. This is the process that carries oxygenated blood away from the heart to the body and returns deoxygenated blood back to the heart. Okay, step 4. All right, so when we left off, we had blood going to the lungs, right? Okay, blood went to the lungs, and it's returning to the left atrium from the lungs. So here's the atrium, the left atrium, okay? It's coming from the pulmonary veins here, so it's coming back from the lungs. And then it is pumped from the atrium into the ventricle. It goes through the left atrioventricular valve, the AV valve, so from atrium to ventricle, right here. And then the blood is pumped to the body from the left ventricle, so it's going through here. There's a valve you can't see very well here called the aortic valve, pumps it to the aorta. Now it's in the aorta, and it leaves to go to the body. And then after it goes to the body and the oxygen is all used up, it comes back in through the superior vena cava and the inferior vena cava into the right atrium. Okay? So those are the two cycles. All right, so which of these is an example of pulmonary circulation? Blood is pumped from the right ventricle to the lungs. Blood is pumped from the left ventricle to the aorta. Blood is pumped from the aorta to the cardiac vein, or blood is pumped from the inferior vena cava to the right atrium.
There is no way I know that.
Well, would you like to look at the slide?
Okay, fine.
All right, remember this is pulmonary circulation, right? This is the part in which blood is coming into the right atrium, right? It's deoxygenated, goes through the right ventricle, and then it's being pumped, being pumped here and here, to be able to get oxygenated. Okay?
All right. Oh, wait. That's A.
It is A. Okay? My recommendation is to just walk around and around the little cycle and until you have a good feeling for where things are going. I will post a little video that I made with my neighbors in which we drew it out on the sidewalk and did it like hopscotch. So I think that's what I think your best bet is for being able to learn the different the pulmonary and the systemic circulation. If we had been in class in person, I would have made you walk around and do it, like that. Okay, so in this chapter, you have learned that animals have adaptations for gas exchange across body surfaces and circulation. So we talked about the respiratory and circulatory systems. We compared oxygen and carbon dioxide exchange in air versus water and talked about how different gas exchange organs worked. We also explored oxygen and carbon dioxide transport in the blood, and we talked about how different circulatory systems work.